I'm gonna take my video off and I'm gonna make loads of notes.
Yeah, that's fine. I've actually got a shining light here actually through the study today. It's quite poetic, really.
Beautiful, Michael.
Hello, everyone. Lovely to be here again. Actually, it doesn't feel that long since we did the last one, to be honest. So it's it's good to be here. How times have changed since that last one, though. So really excited to share a few ideas. I don't know whether I'm going to be as long as Sam actually, because this is quite, I suppose, a bit more of a niche area of feedback, in the sense that I'm really focusing on sort of guided feedback and not necessarily feedback overall. Because I know that when I presented for Brewer before, I did talk about feedback from the general perspective in the terms of, like, so I suppose those core principles. But I've got my mug today, which I'm really happy about. So I've just had my cup of tea while I was listening to Sam through the mug. So big bonus. But yeah, so it's just really this idea, I suppose, of how as professionals we can sort of shine this light on guided feedback for our sort of students, and how we can use feedback as a powerful tool. And talked a lot yesterday, and I'll draw out a few of the things from the book launch that I did yesterday with John Hattie and sort of Shirley Clark, and that was really sort of again really powerful in terms of some of the things that John shared and Shirley shared about the role of feedback. So yeah, we'll get into it. So first of all, as long as this is going to move along, yes, it does, perfect. Something that really sort of stood out to me when John Hattie wrote his sort of closing thoughts to the book the other month was this quote here, and it made me think a little bit about actually what role is feedback having in my own classroom as a classroom practitioner. And he said, like, if feedback falls in a classroom and no one hears it, did it make a sound? And that for me that made me think a little bit more about how am I using feedback to actually feed forward with the pupils I have in front of me. And I think that fundamentally it's something that we do all the time as teachers. We give feedback all the time, even what Sam was talking about there in terms of the sort of process of direct instruction and how we can really sort of drill that into our classroom practice. There was feedback there by doing that constant feedback, by asking those questions. It's still eliciting some form of feedback from our students, and it's really important that we do it. And I suppose, how much of the time are we actually wasting on certain types of feedback that is not actually making a sound? So unpick that a little bit further. It's this idea of, if we're thinking about the art of feedback, there are a couple of, I suppose, core elements to how we give feedback to pupils, but also, I suppose, how we give feedback to colleagues as well, and how we give feedback to parents. And I've talked quite passionately in the new book about this idea that it is a triangulation between pupils, parents, and teachers. And there's some core elements to what, I suppose, what happens in our everyday lives. And I'm not just talking necessarily about, I've applied it in the context of schools and education and its role in education, but we constantly get feedback all the time, don't we? We're constantly given feedback in no matter what we do. So just to give you an example, and I did tell that the Brewed guys on the chat, I had to slip out a little bit during Sam's presentation to make my other half a poached egg, because that's what she really wanted. She obviously gave me feedback on the first poached egg I made, and obviously then it's improved and so forth. But something John and Shirley said yesterday was that actually fundamentally, if we're going to give feedback, which is that first element, we actually, when we give the feedback, we've got to actually want to receive it from the person that's giving it, and then we've got to action it. And ultimately, if we give lots of feedback, which we do as teachers all the time, and no matter what we do in our lives, we give loads and loads of feedback, are we actually wanting to receive that feedback? And then actually, do we action it? And I think these are some core elements to consider when we do give feedback to our pupils. Are they wanting to receive that feedback, and are they then actioning it? And I think that comes down to this point of that if they don't want to receive it, no matter how much time we spend giving it, they won't action it. And then therefore it's that idea, is it actually making any sound? Is it making a difference? And therefore, if it's not, we need to sort of rewind and have a think about actually, well, what can we do to enable our pupils to want to receive it and then want to action it? And that's really what's going to make the difference. And the research really shows that there's so many variabilities around how feedback can be powerful and the role it has, and lots of research around the positive impact it can have. But all of them, despite the variability in the sort of positive influence it can have on achievement, all of them talk very clear about the need for the action part in order for it to become powerful. So it comes back to some of those core principles. If we're thinking about how we're going to guide our pupils with the feedback we give them, we need to prime them first of all to want to receive that feedback. It comes back to that first bit there or the second bit of receiving. And I talk about this importance of curriculum coherence, about us having a coherent curriculum whereby there's a clear understanding from all parties, and that's not just as teachers, but also about pupils having an understanding of where it fits, where their role is within that curriculum, and also sharing it with parents. Because in order to enable our pupils to want to receive that feedback so then they can action it, they need to actually know, well, what's the purpose of what they're doing, and why does it require them to action it. So having that clear curriculum coherence, and I know that Kat Howard talks a lot about curriculum coherence, and that idea that it's really important that we share that journey with them. And Dylan Williams talked a lot about in his sort of formative assessment work that having that clarity in terms of what is intended in the curriculum is really important. Second part is this idea of establishing and embedding the art of success. So if we want pupils to receive the feedback and if we want them to action it, they need to know what is going to be those successful actions. What does it look like? And it comes back again to that idea that we really need to share that success with them. And Rosenshine, again, he talks a lot about the role of modeling and how the best teachers, the most effective teachers, model success regularly. And that's really key in order to prime our pupils for the feedback we want to give them. So establishing and embedding the art of success. And that comes down to embedding the art of success around the particular subject. So talk about this idea, well, what does it actually mean to be a successful geographer? What does it mean to be a successful historian? What does it mean to be a successful writer or mathematician or scientist? What does that actually mean? And it might be that as sort of subjects within schools that we give that sort of core success criteria, what it means to be successful in our particular subjects with those pupils at the start of the year. So be very sort of overtly clear about what it actually means to be successful, and then underpinning the success in terms of the actual concepts and processes they're studying, and then the skills that we're expecting them to demonstrate. So two core elements to the sharing the art of success around being an effective mathematician or scientist, and the art of success around the actual application or demonstration of that sort of core knowledge that we are imparting onto our pupils. And then linking with that curriculum coherence is the clarity of learning intentions. There's a lot, and I talk about it in craft as well, a lot around sharing learning intentions, the fact that it becomes almost like white noise, a bit of pretty background on a PowerPoint, and maybe a policy within the school. Every lesson we have to display a learning objective. Every lesson we have to write the learning objective down. And again, it comes back to that point. Well, we can give them learning objectives, we can give them success criteria, but do they actually want to receive that? And if they don't want to receive it, why don't they want to receive it? And is it then having the required sort of springboard to enable our pupils to action when it comes to giving them that feedback? And I think that comes down to the sort of notion, like I say, that for many years we have to share the learn intentions. So we share it through a learn objective, and that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the effective process. So something that definitely has sort of changed my practice in sort of recent years is moving towards sharing all those learning intentions through, maybe as Sam Strickland talks a lot passionately about, big questions, the use of big questions in lessons, or potentially about what we're using in the new trust that I work in, which is hypotheses. And actually through using those, it's engaging our pupils in that sort of process at the beginning of a particular sort of sequence within that learning journey about why it is that we're doing it, what's the core focus, what's the intentions, and therefore then imparting that knowledge to enable them to move towards that intended goal. And that's really important, because they need to know, they need to know what the learning intention is in order for us to be able to give them feedback, and then for them to be able to receive it and action it. And then that idea of a receptive culture. And John Hattie talked about this yesterday, and he gave the example of him and Shirley Clark, how sometimes we spend a lot of time wrapping around the positivity of the work they've done, even if it's not necessarily great. And I think that comes down to this point of, we don't as teachers want to give negative feedback to pupils, because there's a lot of issues around the idea that it can demotivate pupils, and actually we need to give them lots of praise, and then we insert some areas for improvement. But ultimately, as John talked about yesterday, that and Shirley Clark talked about it as well, that's not necessarily an effective way to give feedback, because feedback is there to support us in moving forward, no matter whether we are pupils or even parents or teachers. Its role is key. And if we're going to really prime our pupils for effective guided feedback, we've got to create that receptive culture first. And we can't just expect our pupils to want to receive feedback if we don't have a relationship with them. And like I say, John Hattie and Shirley Clark talked about yesterday, they have a strong relationship, they've built that relationship, and therefore giving direct sort of feedback to each other, they can do that because they have that relationship there. And I'm sure over time, as you build a relationship with your class from the start of the year, or you've been in the school for a while, and therefore you have that rapport with pupils around the school community, it becomes much easier to create that receptive culture. But unless we build that culture, pupils are not going to want to receive the feedback, and then they're not going to want to action it. And then comes back to that point of, we can give it, but is it having that desired impact? So let's unpick a little bit further. So I'm going to talk about this idea of some 3 elements to guided feedback. And this first bit about self-regulated feedback. So we want to create that receptive culture, and we want to share those learning intentions. We want to demonstrate what success looks like. And by doing that, we can really support that process of self-regulation. You can see here that Costans and Van Gogh and Pass, some of their work that they did on self-regulated learning. And they talk about it as being an active and constructive process in which a learner plans, monitors, and exerts control over his or her own learning process. And if we go back to what I've just said, in order for them to be able to do that, they need to know those 4 key aspects. Because if we don't prime them first of all, they won't be able to undertake some self-regulated feedback. And Dylan Williams talked about in his formative assessment, it's really important that our sort of pupils have the opportunity to be able to self-regulate their own learning. And it builds on some examples. So this is the example of their model. And it's really sort of unpicks the role of self-regulation. And what stood out to me in particular when I did some research on this is that when we give the feedback to pupils, there is going to be an element of perception. And this is the case on any feedback we give, because we will perceive that feedback in different ways. And there are sort of three core triggers of the feedback, or the way in which feedback is interpreted. So triggers around our own personal identity, triggers around the relationships that we have, and triggers around truth and the things that we sort of willing to accept or not accept as individuals. So when we give a task to pupils, they're going to have a perception of that task. We're going to have a perception of the task, and overall as a group, they're going to have different perceptions of the task. And therefore, we really need to spend the time in investing in that sort of coherence, going back to this point, coherence and clarity of learning intentions. Because unless we do that, and until we do that, when we give that feedback after undertaking the task, it may look very different to what we expected. And I'm sure, and I've felt it before in times when I've been teaching, that I have an intention of what I'm expecting for that particular task. But actually, when they undertake the task, when they start it, when I go around and monitor it, what they're doing is often very different. And I think it works quite well in what Sam's talked about direct instruction. That unless we give that clear instruction, unless we invest that time in the way in which we deliver our sort of explanations during that initial phase of a lesson or a sequence of learning, then their perceptions may change, okay? And therefore, when it comes to them self-regulating, they may not be able to do that effectively. So going to share a few examples, and this is just an example of some guided feedback that I've done across sort of autumn term. And I will talk a bit about remote learning, because I know that people have asked about that over recent weeks, and how sort of feedback can sort of fit in a remote learning context. So you can see here we've got a bit of a guided feedback sheet, and you can see that there's particular areas here, and I suppose it comes back to the sort of whole class feedback sheet that is often used in schools, and this is probably a similar idea to that. But here, the sort of key point here is that it's about enabling pupils to make those improvements that are listed. So look at a set of books, no particular sort of marks allocated to it, no particular sort of comments about sort of extended writing of what they need to do there next. It's all those sort of core improvements on the sort of right hand side there in the box. And each student will have a particular area that will need to be improved around not improving specifically the task, which is often what we look at, but more about improving the application of knowledge and the skills that we wanted them to demonstrate. So in this case, in this question here, looking at in particular about assessing the validity of a statement, which is inherently quite a high level sort of skill and task to complete for pupils. So it's about unpicking their ability to do that rather than repeating or improving that specific piece of work. So you can see the guided feedback bit in the bottom box. So I took a particular example of where the particular pupil had achieved part of that success criteria. And in this case, it's for a GCSE style question. And you can see that before they looked at their own response again, and before they went about looking at how they could apply and improve and feed forward into another sort of assessing task, I asked 3 core questions, and you can see them there. And what I wanted to get from it was I wanted them to understand where this particular one of their peers, because it was one of their peers in the class, where one of their peers had actually demonstrated that success criteria. So I asked those 3 core questions. Where is there evidence that this is response to talking about Tunisia? Does this response refer to the impact on the development gap, and what could be added to improve the assessment of the statement? So I got them to undertake that particular sort of task first before getting them to do any feed forward work. And that was really important. And when I'm referring to guided feedback, this was like a core part of guiding them through that process of giving them feedback specifically about how they can improve their assessment within geography. And then you can see here, and this is a second example, and there's quite a bit here, and I just want to break it down a little bit more. And I think that often we sort of fundamentally believe that giving them less sometimes with the feedback is actually more, but it depends on the task in which they're undertaken. And in this case here, when it's an extended piece of work and we're looking at sort of higher level demonstration of knowledge and skills, application of knowledge in the assessment skill, really we want to give them as much guided feedback as possible. So you can see here again, we've got a similar idea of the improvements and the directed improvements. Again, those are on the specific piece of work, possibly for that particular pupil where it's applicable. But then the other important bit here, we've got an added bit about sort of vocabulary upgrade. So when we're guiding them through feedback, and part of that, as we talked about at the start, priming them for feedback is knowing what the success is within the subject. What does it look like to be a successful geographer in this case? Well, this is some examples here of how we can work to improve in that specific area of geography, which is around about benefits of deforestation, but how they can improve their vocabulary through discussing that particular statement. You can see there some examples there where they've been given some ideas of how they could do that. And again, that's guiding them through, because then the next stage is actually to go back and have a think about, well, what sort of phrases did they use individually, and how could they then improve their own vocabulary to move forward and be a more successful geographer. We then got the guided response. Now in this case, slightly different, but in this one it is about a teacher model, a snapshot of what it would look like, the success in this particular style of question when they're being asked to discuss the extent, and it's given there. And then the added feature here, and we've worked a lot on this over the last couple of months, is having a QR code that takes them directly to a guided task that is based on sort of the common areas and misconceptions and maybe parts that for that particular group of students, the teacher wants to sort of direct that feedback to feed forward and improve. So then we come back to this idea, that's the self-regulated feedback, okay? That idea of giving them the tools and giving them the guidance to do their own sort of self-directed improvements. Then I'm talking next now about this idea of guided peer feedback. So 1989, Sadler talked about this idea that peer feedback is when pupils have the opportunity to read their peers' work, and that allows them to see examples and identify what he called as graduations in quality, and therefore generate a greater awareness of the strengths and flaws in their own sort of work. And that's really key. Now, I think as a profession, and I've been guilty of this, is probably right at the start of my career, I used a lot of peer assessment, peer and self-assessment, because we were told that actually it's a way to get pupils talking, and it's a way to reduce our own marking, because the marking, we sort of got clouded in our judgment of what feedback was. It was all about marking, marking, marking. Talked about it before, marking was king. More you marked, the better you were. We know that that's absolute nonsense, but that was what was the sort of trend in education at that point. Then it sort of fell by the wayside, and I got a bit despondent with peer assessment, self-assessment. I thought this is an absolute waste of time. Reason being was because every time I used to say to a class, right, I want you to peer assess your work, that I'd have a couple of murmurs, oh, I'm not doing this. Then I'd have pupils raising the hand, well, I don't agree with what they put, sir, that's not right. I think it's worth more than this. or I think I've done this, or then they might have, so I don't really know whether they've got this or not. And I think we became clouded in what we were using peer assessment for and self-assessment. And that's because we were phrasing it as assessment. And ultimately, we don't want them to assess that piece of work. That's our role as teachers. We ultimately, we're the experts. But what actually we want pupils to do is to engage in some guided peer feedback, giving each other feedback. And I think that's important. That's what Sadler identified, that it's an opportunity to identify those graduations in quality and generate an awareness of strengths and flaws in their own work. But again, if we want to give them the opportunity to do that, and we want them to actively receive that from their peers that we said at the start, to then action that feedback that they get, we need to, as we said, clarify those learning intentions. They need to know what success looks like. So they need to have success criteria that is really drilled down into what it is they're looking for their in their peers' work, not marking it, because that again is nonsense. We're not asking them to mark it, but ask them to think about, how is your work different to your peers? What's different about it? And I think that we don't invest enough time in this idea of giving them the opportunity to talk about their work, and this idea of creating that buy-in. So that we create that buy-in where they have that discussion, that receptive culture, remember at the start, they have that initial peer conversation. So it might be then when we get them to undertake a particular application task, we encourage them, we guide them to have a peer conversation first of all, before they write anything. We've got the success criteria, you've done that in explicit instruction, you've explained. Now you want them to have that peer conversation. What are they going to write? Let them have that discussion for a couple of minutes. That open-ended conversation. What are you going to write? Oh, I'm going to write this, and I'm going to put this because of this, and I think this is going to work particularly well because of this. Get them to sort of unpick and link it to that explicit success criteria. Then give them opportunities to practice that independent practice, and then give them the opportunity to have that peer conferencing. Okay, so based on what we talked about, this is what I've put, this is what I've done. How is yours different? Why did you do that? Give them the opportunity to do that. And I think that can be really powerful in that part about increasing that receptive nature to want to receive the feedback and then to want to action it. And I'm not saying that we should be doing that every lesson, sort of guided peer feedback. And that's why I've sort of looked at these sort of core elements of sort of self and directed feedback here, as well as sort of more sort of teacher focused. And this just gives you some further examples here of some guided feedback that I've already talked about. But then I want to pick out this part about explicit success criteria. I suppose the benefit of actually being in the classroom and I suppose trialing some of these ideas and trying to apply some of this research that I've read is that there was a little bit of a light bulb moment in one of my classes just before Christmas. It was a year 11 student, and when they undertook this particular task, and it was looking at hydrograph, and they had to talk about hydrograph, but the question wanted them to actually extract information from that hydrograph. What I said to them before they actually wrote their answer was that the explicit success criteria was, I wanted you to demonstrate explanation, so reasons for the shape. I wanted you to talk specifically about the shape. In this case, is it a flashy hydrograph? What happens to the rising limb and the falling limb? What happens to the lag time? What happens to whether it compare with more gentle hydrograph? And then specific references to the figure. I want you to extract information. It's a skill. I want you to demonstrate your knowledge of what we've studied through those particular sort of storm or flood hydrographs that they were given. After they'd written it, I said, right, go back through your work now, okay? And this is this guided feedback. I want you to look at where you've done that. And they were reading through it. And then the one lad, he's huffed and he sighed, and I was like, "Is everything all right, Dylan?" He was like, "No, I've not referenced the figure, sir, at all." And it was almost like, I say, a light bulb moment for him and for me, because he identified what he hadn't done himself without me sort of sitting there for hours marking books, giving the books back individually a week later, whatever it might have been. It was instant feedback that had been guided through that explicit success criteria right at the start. And I think there's a lot to be said about how we can sort of really sort of focus our attentions on that moving forward. So if we go back to the start, because I'm conscious of time and people may want to ask questions or may not, but go back to the point I've said about John Hattie. If feedback falls in a classroom and no one hears it, did it make a sound? Really fundamental. And then those core elements, we can give lots of feedback, but do pupils want to receive it, whether that be from their peers, whether that be from their parents or us, and therefore then are they able to action it to actually make it powerful?
Michael, I presume the pause was end. I only jumped
that
in.
Dramatic pause.
Love it. No, Michael, thank you so much. There is, I've just typed in the chat box. Are there any questions? We've got 5 minutes to quiz you on the art of feedback. We've got one question from Graham. I think this is going to be a theme of today. It's going to be remote learning because we're all sort of in the thick of it, aren't we? How have you successfully engaged students in feedback who are reluctant to receive and act on this during pandemic home learning?
I think, and I've thought about this over the last couple of days, and I've seen a lot on Twitter about how can we do this in a remote learning context. And I think we're missing something here, because we can do everything that we do in the classroom in a remote learning context. We can explain, we can give feedback, we can question. It might be that there's a slight delay potentially because of the technology, etc., and it depends on the platform that schools are using. But again, it comes back to, well, how can you create receptive culture? And I know that there's been a lot of talk. I mean, Doug Lamov talked very passionately and spoken about having cameras on for pupils. And what I've noticed with when the cameras are on, it still feels like you are there in the classroom in that context. And having the classroom, having the cameras on, in particular in the lessons that I'm teaching remotely, it's had a real positive impact on them still wanting to engage in questioning and sharing ideas, and still engage in sort of discussions around specific areas of feedback on a piece of work that they might have been doing. So again, I think it comes back to that first bit, almost like a bit of an operation reset, I suppose. We're into remote learning, reset. How can we set up our virtual classroom so that people still want to receive feedback despite it being in a remote context?
Michael, thank you. Yeah, the camera one's interesting, isn't it? Although some schools, their safeguarding they might not be allowed cameras on. I don't know the ins and outs of it, etc. But yeah, it's one way, isn't it, to ensure as well they are sat there engaged with the lesson as well. They are there, if not virtually, in person.
I think Sam brought up that good point. If you can use those cameras, he mentioned this idea of using sort of mini whiteboards, or whilst the students might not have mini whiteboards, they should all have like at least a piece of paper and a pencil at home, just to use that as an alternative thing to sort of, show their responses and things.
Doug Lamov posted something the other day. I've not checked it out, but posted something about someone providing some advice for checking for understanding in remote learning. So it might be worth checking out.
Cool. Right, Michael, we haven't got any more quick, but of course this conversation can continue on Twitter. Buy your book, obviously, that will be full of answers.